The year was 1590, and Scotland stood at the precipice of madness. Picture Edinburgh in winter, not the romanticized city of guidebooks, but the real Edinburgh of 4 centuries past streets ran black with frozen mud and human waste. Smoke from 10,000 chimneys created a permanent twilight that clung to stone buildings like a burial shroud. This was a world where electricity was centuries away, where night meant absolute darkness, and where every unexplained sound in that darkness could be the devil himself. Into this world of shadows and superstition, we follow the footsteps of Reverend James Carmichael, a man whose name history would forget, but whose actions would help write one of the darkest chapters in Scottish history. Carmichael was everything a minister should be in 1590. 43 years old, with graying temples that spoke of wisdom and hands unmarked by physical labor, the hands of a scholar. He spent his days in his study, a modest room attached to St. Giles Cathedral, surrounded by leather-bound volumes of theology and philosophy. The smell of old parchment and beeswax candles was his perfume. The scratching of quill on paper was his music. He believed in order. He believed that the world operated according to divine law, clear, logical, and absolute. God above, the devil below, and mankind suspended between them, fighting daily for salvation. It was simple. It was clean. It was about to shatter completely. The first crack in his ordered world came on December 12th, just as the winter sun, what little penetrated Edinburgh's perpetual smoke, was dying behind Arthur's Seat. Carmichael was translating a passage from Augustine when he heard the heavy knock at his door. Not the tentative tap of a parishioner seeking counsel, but the authoritative pound of official business. His housekeeper, a nervous woman named Margaret, appeared in his doorway, her face pale as fresh linen. Behind her stood 2 men in the crimson and gold livery of the royal household. One of them held a scroll bearing the unmistakable seal of King James VI. "Reverend Carmichael," the taller guard intoned, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "His Majesty commands your immediate presence at Holyrood Palace." The walk from St. Giles to Holyrood normally took 20 minutes. That night it felt like a journey between worlds. The guards flanked him, their torches creating a moving island of light in the darkness. Citizens scattered from their path. In those days, when the king's men came for you at night, it was rarely for good news. Carmichael clutched his worn leather satchel containing his Bible and writing materials. He told himself this was routine. Perhaps the king needed a theological opinion. Perhaps there was a dispute about church doctrine. But his heart knew better. The king did not summon ministers at nightfall for academic discussions. Holyrood Palace loomed before them, its towers disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. This was not the refined palace of later centuries. This was still partly a fortress, built for defense against both earthly and supernatural enemies. The walls were 3 feet thick. Iron bars crossed every window. Gargoyles leered from the corners, their stone faces worn smooth by centuries of Scottish rain. They entered through a side door, away from the main courtyard. The guards led him up a narrow spiral staircase, their footsteps echoing off stone walls that wept with moisture. They climbed past the public chambers, past the staterooms, up and up until Carmichael's legs burned and his breath came in gasps. Finally, they emerged into a private chamber that few outside the king's inner circle had ever seen. It was surprisingly small, almost intimate. A fire roared in the hearth, but its warmth couldn't chase away the cold that seemed to emanate from the very stones. Maps covered one wall, not just of Scotland, but strange charts marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Books were everywhere, most of them black-bound, their titles in languages Carmichael didn't recognize. And there, pacing before the fire like a caged wildcat, was King James VI. History would remember James as many things: the monarch who united the Scottish and English crowns, the sponsor of the Bible translation that bears his name, a patron of Shakespeare. But on this December night in 1590, he was something else entirely. A man consumed by paranoid terror. The king was 34 years old, but fear had aged him. His eyes, which contemporary portraits show as intelligent and alert, now darted constantly to the room's corners. His hands, when not gripping the pommel of his sword, trembled with a slight but persistent shake. This was a man who slept fully clothed, with daggers under his pillow, who tested every meal for poison, who saw conspiracy in every shadow. "Reverend Carmichael," James said without preamble, his Scottish accent thick with emotion, "do you believe in witches?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Carmichael knew there was only one acceptable answer. "I believe in the reality of Satan's work in this world, Your Majesty, as Scripture commands us." James stopped pacing and fixed Carmichael with those haunted eyes. "Scripture, yes, but have you seen it? Have you witnessed the devil's hand reaching into our realm?" "I have seen evil, Your Majesty, in the hearts of sinful men, No!" James slammed his fist on a table, making candles jump. "Not metaphor, not theology, real witches, real sorcery, real attempts on my life." The king began to speak, and his words tumbled out in a torrent. He told of his recent voyage to Denmark to collect his bride, Anne. He told of storms that rose from nowhere, waves tall as castle walls, winds that screamed with almost human voices. Ships had been lost. Good men had drowned. And these were no natural tempests. "They have confessed," James said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "In North Berwick, we have captured an entire coven. They gathered in the kirk on All Hallows' Eve. They danced with the devil himself. They baptized cats with Christian names and threw them into the sea to raise the storms. They made wax images of me and passed them hand to hand, each witch cursing them, trying to melt my very soul." Carmichael listened, his scholar's mind trying to process what he was hearing. The King of Scotland, one of the most learned men in Europe, was describing witchcraft as if it were as real as the French threat or the Spanish Navy. "We have their leader," James continued, moving closer to Carmichael. The minister could smell the wine on the king's breath, see the red veins in his eyes. A man named John Fian, a schoolmaster if you can believe it, a man of letters like yourself, who sold his soul for Satan's knowledge. The king gripped Carmichael's shoulder with surprising strength. "But here's the problem, Reverend. He recants. He denies. The devil has given him supernatural strength to resist our questioning. We need documentation, proper documentation. The world must know what happened here. England must know. Rome must know. This is not Scottish superstition. This is a real battle between heaven and hell, and Scotland is the battlefield." James released him and walked to his desk, where he picked up a leather-bound manuscript. "I am writing a book. Demonology. I call it a scientific study of witchcraft, to educate the world. But I need evidence. I need confessions. I need someone I trust, someone of unimpeachable character, to witness and record the interrogations." The king turned back to Carmichael, and now his expression was not fearful, but calculating. "You, Reverend, you will be my chronicler. You will watch as we extract the truth from Dr. Fian. You will write down every word, every detail. Your account will become the official record. News from Scotland, we'll call it. It will be printed, distributed, read in every court in Europe." Carmichael felt the walls of the small chamber pressing in. "Your Majesty, I am honored, but I am merely a minister. I know nothing of legal proceedings or—" "You know truth from lies?" James interrupted. "You know God from the devil. That is all the expertise required." The king's tone suggested this was not a request. "When do I begin?" Carmichael asked, his mouth dry as dust. "Now," the king said. "Tonight. The devil does not rest, and neither shall we." As guards prepared to escort Carmichael to the Tolbooth prison, James added one more thing, almost casually. "Reverend, you should know the traditional methods of questioning have proven insufficient with Dr. Fian. We have been forced to employ more aggressive techniques. I trust this won't trouble your conscience? After all, we are not dealing with a man anymore, but with a vessel of Satan himself." Carmichael nodded, not trusting his voice. As he followed the guards back into the cold Edinburgh night, he didn't yet understand that he was about to become complicit in something that would haunt him until his dying day. He thought he was going to witness the triumph of good over evil. Instead, he was about to discover that sometimes the real devil isn't the one being tortured, it's the one holding the pen. The Tolbooth prison squatted against Edinburgh's skyline like a cancer made of stone. Known to locals as the Heart of Midlothian, it was the black heart of Scottish justice, a place where law and suffering merged into something indistinguishable from vengeance. Carmichael followed the guards down, always down, beneath the level of the street, beneath the level of what felt like humanity itself. The stone stairs were worn smooth by centuries of prisoners' feet, some walking down to their interrogation, others being dragged back up, no longer capable of walking at all. With each step, the world above faded. The sounds of the city, the cry of a night watchman, the bark of dogs, the creak of shop signs in the wind, all of it disappeared, replaced by something worse than silence. It was the sound of waiting, the sound of held breath, the sound of a place where screams were so common they'd become part of the architecture. The guard leading them carried a torch that threw wild shadows on the walls. In those shadows, Carmichael's imagination painted scenes of horror. Every stain on the stone could be blood. Every scratch could be the desperate clawing of a prisoner. The minister found himself breathing through his mouth. The air tasted of metal and fierce sweat. And something else, something organic and wrong that coated the back of his throat. They stopped at a door reinforced with iron bands, thick as a man's wrist. The guard produced a key that looked medieval, all crude angles and rust. The lock's mechanism groaned as it turned, a sound like a dying man's last breath. "The chamber," the guard said simply, and pushed open the door. Carmichael had prepared himself for horror. He had read accounts of martyrs, studied woodcuts of the Inquisition's methods. He thought he understood what he would see. He was wrong. The chamber was almost mundane in its efficiency. It was not the theatrical dungeon of Gothic imagination. No skeletons in chains, no walls inscribed with the desperate prayers of the condemned. It was a workspace, tools hung on the walls with the same orderly precision as a blacksmith shop. A table held instruments arranged by size. There was even a clerk's desk in the corner, with ink, quills, and parchment waiting. His desk, his station, his role in what was to come. But it was the center of the room that drew the eye and wouldn't let go. There sat a man who had once been John Fian. The schoolmaster was 35 years old, though he looked ancient now. His scholarly robes were gone, replaced by a rough shirt soaked with sweat and substances Carmichael didn't want to identify. His hands that had once held chalk and quill, that had taught children to write their letters, were grotesquely swollen, the fingers purple and black where the pillowinks had been applied. These were thumbscrews by another name, devices that crushed the fingers slowly, methodically, until the bones splintered like dry twigs. But it was Fian's eyes that struck Carmichael most forcefully. They were still intelligent, still aware, still human. This was not some demonic vessel, some supernatural enemy of God. This was a man, a scholar like himself, reduced to meat and terror. Standing beside Fian were two men in leather aprons, stained dark with use. They had the casual bearing of craftsmen interrupted at their work. One was cleaning his fingernails with a thin blade. The other was adjusting what looked like a boot made of iron and wood. A third man, dressed in the black robes of a magistrate, stepped forward. This was Lord Sinclair, a name that would appear in no official records, but whose work in that chamber would echo through centuries. "Reverend Carmichael," Sinclair said with a politician's smile, "how good of you to join us. His Majesty speaks highly of your precision with words. We have great need of precision tonight." Carmichael moved to the desk on trembling legs. The parchment was high quality, almost translucent in its fineness. The ink was fresh and black. Everything was ready for him to begin his work. He sat down, took up the quill, and tried to stop his hand from shaking. "Now then, Dr. Fian," Sinclair addressed the prisoner with mock courtesy, "shall we continue our conversation? The Reverend here will ensure everything is properly documented. Every word you speak will be preserved for posterity. Your confession will be read by kings and scholars. You should be honored." Fian raised his head with effort. When he spoke, his voice was cracked but clear. "I have nothing to confess. I am a Christian man. I teach children their letters. I know no witchcraft. Please." Sinclair sighed theatrically. "Still the devil speaks through him. The corruption runs deep." He nodded to one of the men in leather aprons. "The boots, I think. But slowly. We have all night, and the Reverend needs time to write." They brought forward the device Carmichael had noticed, an apparatus of 4 wooden boards that would encase the leg from ankle to knee, with spaces for wooden wedges to be hammered in, gradually crushing the limb. As they began strapping Fian's legs into the device, the door opened again. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. King James himself entered, accompanied by 2 courtiers. The king's presence transformed the chamber. What had been merely horrible became theatrical. James approached Fian like a natural philosopher examining a specimen, circling him, observing him from different angles. Fascinating. the king murmured. "See how the pupils dilate? The classical texts speak of this. The devil's presence affects the physical body in predictable ways." He turned to Carmichael. "You're recording the physical symptoms, aren't you? These details are crucial for my demonology." Carmichael nodded, unable to speak. He wrote, "The subject displays signs of demonic inhabitation as described in classical sources." It was his first lie, the first step on a path he couldn't yet see the end of. The king gestured impatiently. "Proceed with the questioning." The man with the mallet selected a thin wedge no thicker than a child's finger. He placed it between the boot and Fian's shin. He raised the mallet. The sound it made was modest, just a tap, really. But Fian's whole body went rigid. A hiss escaped between his clenched teeth. "He admits," the king said calmly, as if commenting on the weather, "that he met with the devil. Write it down." Carmichael's hand froze. "Your Majesty, he has said no." The king's eyes found his, and in them was something worse than madness. It was perfect, cold sanity. "Did I ask you what he said, Reverend?" "The devil holds his tongue. We must interpret his silence. We must translate his resistance into truth. Now write." Carmichael wrote, "The prisoner admits to meeting with the devil." Another wedge, larger this time. The mallet rose and fell with more force. The crack that followed was wet, organic. Fian's scream started low and rose to something that didn't sound human anymore. "He confesses to raising the storms," the king continued over the screaming. "He confesses to attempting regicide through sorcery," Carmichael wrote. Each word was a betrayal. Each sentence was a nail in Fian's coffin. But he wrote because the alternative was to join Fian in that chair, to feel those boots crushing his own legs. The mallet rose and fell, rose and fell. The rhythm of it became hypnotic, terrible. With each strike, the king dictated another confession. With each confession, Carmichael's pen scratched across the parchment. He sailed in a sieve with his coven. Crack. He baptized cats in blasphemy. Crack. He kissed the devil's posteriors in submission. Crack. Fian had stopped screaming. He was making a sound now that was worse, a continuous, low moan, like wind through a broken door. His legs were no longer legs. They were geometry gone wrong, angles that shouldn't exist in human anatomy. And still, Carmichael wrote. His hand moved automatically now, disconnected from his will. He was no longer a minister or a scholar. He was a machine for converting agony into words, for transforming truth into lies. The king leaned close to Fian's ear. "Tell me about the others. Give me names. Give me your coven, and this ends." For a moment, Fian's eyes focused. He looked directly at the king, then at Carmichael. When he spoke, his words were clear despite everything. "There are no others. I am innocent before God. I am innocent." The king straightened, his face twisting with frustration. "More wedges, larger ones. The devil's grip is strong, but we are stronger." But there was no room for more wedges. Fian's legs were destroyed, crushed beyond recognition. The torturer looked questioningly at Sinclair, who looked at the king. "The fire, then," James said quietly. "Let's see if hell's flames can drive out hell's master." They brought a brazier of coals. The irons they heated in it glowed like small suns in the dark chamber. Carmichael couldn't watch what came next, but he could hear it. He could smell it, and worst of all, he had to write it. "The prisoner confesses to all charges," his hand wrote while his mind screamed. "He admits his compact with Satan. He reveals the details of the conspiracy." Finally, mercifully, Fian lost consciousness. His body slumped in the chair, held upright only by the restraints. The king, disappointed that his performance had ended, gathered his courtiers. "Excellent work, Reverend," James said, pausing at Carmichael's desk. He picked up the pages covered with fabricated confessions. "This is truth. This is what the world needs to see. Polish it. Make it sing. Make it a story that will terrify the devil himself." As the king swept from the chamber, Carmichael remained at his desk, staring at the pages before him. They were covered in neat, precise handwriting, his handwriting, but the words were not his. They belonged to something else, to power, to fear, to the machinery of state terror that ground truth into dust. He looked at Fian's broken form, still unconscious in the chair. He looked at the instruments on the walls. He looked at his pen. He had come here believing he would witness the defeat of evil. Instead, he had become its secretary. "3 days. That was all the time James Carmichael had to transform the horror he had witnessed into propaganda that would shape European thought for generations. He sat in his study at St. Giles, the same room where he had once found peace among his books and manuscripts. Now it felt like a torture chamber of a different kind. The familiar had become foreign. The crucifix on his wall seemed to watch him with accusation. The scratching of his quill sounded like fingernails on stone, or like the sound wooden wedges made when they splintered bone. Before him lay 2 documents. The first was his original record from the chamber, pages stained with ink blots that looked like blood spatter, words crossed out and rewritten, margins filled with fragmentary notes that captured the raw truth of what had occurred. The second was virgin parchment, waiting for the official version. The lie that would become history. He began to write, and as he did, something extraordinary happened. The scholar in him, the part that knew how to craft words and shape narratives, took control. He found himself not merely transcribing lies, but improving them, making them more believable, more terrifying, more useful to the king's purpose. Where his notes said, "The prisoner screamed," he wrote, "The demon within him raged against God's justice." Where his notes said, "Crushing of the legs," he wrote, "The necessary application of lawful persuasion." Where his notes said, "Fian claimed innocence," he wrote, "The accused cunningly dissembled, as is the way of Satan's servants." He was no longer just a witness or a scribe. He had become an author of horror, a creator of nightmares that would send thousands to their deaths across Europe. The news from Scotland wasn't just a record. It was a weapon, and he was sharpening it with every word. As he wrote, he began to smell smoke. Not the comfortable smoke of his study fire, but something acrid, chemical, wrong. He checked his hearth. The fire burned normally. He opened his window. The Edinburgh air was no more smoky than usual. The smell was in his mind, a phantom sensation from the chamber, the scent of hot iron on flesh. It would never leave him. On the second night, as he worked by candlelight, he heard dripping, a steady, rhythmic sound. He searched his study for leaks, checked the ceiling for damage. Nothing. The sound was memory made manifest, the drip of blood from Fian's chair, marking time like a hideous clock. He wrote faster, desperately, as if by finishing he could escape these phantoms. He crafted dialogue that had never been spoken, described satanic rituals that existed only in the king's fevered imagination. He wrote of Fian flying through the air, of sailing in sieves, of storms raised by throwing cats into the sea. Each absurdity was presented with scholarly authority, supported by references to classical texts and theological precedents. The genius of his construction was that he made the impossible seem not just possible, but inevitable. Of course witches existed. Of course they threatened the king. Of course extreme measures were justified. His prose built a world where torture wasn't cruelty, but necessity, where the king's paranoia wasn't madness, but wisdom. He finished on the third morning, his hand cramped into a claw from continuous writing. The manuscript was perfect, clean, clear, compelling. It was his masterpiece of deception. He delivered it personally to Holyrood Palace. King James read it in his presence, occasionally making small sounds of approval. When he finished, he looked at Carmichael with something approaching affection. "This is God's work, Reverend. This document will save souls. It will teach the world to recognize and fight the devil. You should be proud." Carmichael said nothing. He couldn't. His throat had closed around words he could never speak. The execution was set for January 27th, 1591. It would be public, of course. The crowd needed to see justice done. They needed their monster. The castle hill was transformed into an amphitheater of death. Carpenters had built raised platforms for the nobility. Vendors set up stalls selling food and drink. It had the atmosphere of a fair, complete with children on their father's shoulders, eager to see the witch burn. Carmichael was given a place of honor near the platform where the stake had been erected. He stood among other ministers and scholars, men who nodded approvingly and quoted passages from his News from Scotland. They congratulated him on his service to God and King. Each word of praise was like a nail driven into his conscience. The crowd's roar announced Fian's arrival before Carmichael saw him. They brought what remained of the schoolmaster on a hurdle, dragging him through the streets like refuse. The man who had once taught Edinburgh's children their letters was now unrecognizable, a broken doll of splintered bones and ruined flesh. But he was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was still alive. They had to carry him to the stake, his destroyed legs unable to bear weight. As they bound him to the post, his head lolled forward, then slowly, with tremendous effort, rose. His eyes swept across the crowd, past the jeering faces, past the righteous ministers, past the excited children. They found Carmichael. In that moment, across the chaos of the crowd, their eyes met and held. Carmichael expected to see hatred. He expected accusation. He expected the fury of the damned. Instead, he saw pity. John Fian, broken and about to burn, looked at James Carmichael with compassion. It was the look of a man who understood that there were different kinds of damnation, and that the man with the pen would suffer longer than the man at the stake. The executioner approached with his torch. The crowd fell silent, anticipating the spectacle. But Fian spoke, his voice carrying despite his condition. "I forgive you all. I forgive even those who bear false witness. May God have mercy on your souls." He was looking directly at Carmichael when he said it. The torch touched the kindling. The fire caught quickly. They had made sure of that, soaking the wood with pitch. Fian did not scream. Perhaps he had no screams left, or perhaps he had found some grace beyond pain. He simply looked at the sky as the flames rose around him, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. The crowd cheered as the fire consumed him. King James watched from his window, nodding with satisfaction. The other ministers praised God for delivering them from evil. Carmichael stood frozen, the heat from the pyre warming his face while his soul turned to ice. He had written the words that lit this fire. His pen had been the true instrument of execution. The story should end there, with the smoke clearing and Edinburgh returning to its daily business. But for James Carmichael, it was only the beginning of a different kind of burning. He returned to his study, to his books and manuscripts, but he could no longer write. Every time he picked up a pen, he saw Fian's eyes. Every time he dipped it in ink, he saw blood. The scratching of quill on parchment became the sound of wooden wedges breaking bones. Days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years. Carmichael aged rapidly, his hair going white as snow. He was honored, celebrated, given prestigious positions. His news from Scotland was printed and reprinted, translated into dozen languages, used as evidence in witch trials across Europe. Each printing was another weight on his soul. He tried to pray, but the words turned to ash in his mouth. He tried to preach, but could only speak of mercy and forgiveness, sermons that grew increasingly desperate until his congregation grew concerned for his health. 20 years passed. Carmichael sat in his study, now an old man of 63. Before him lay a fresh sheet of parchment, as virgin white as that long-ago page on which he'd written his great lie. He picked up his pen for the first time in 2 decades. He began to write, the same sentence over and over. I am a man of God. I am a man of God. I am a man of God. But with each repetition, the ink spread and blotted, turning the words into illegible stains that looked like spiders, like shadows, like the smoke from a burning man. The scratching of his pen grew louder and louder until it filled the room, filled his mind, filled the universe with its horrible music. They found him the next morning, slumped over his desk. The page before him was solid black, covered entirely with ink, as if he had tried to blot out the sun itself. In his hand was his pen, still clutched with desperate strength. The official record states that Reverend James Carmichael died peacefully in his sleep, a faithful servant of God and crowned to the end. But his housekeeper, Margaret, who found him, swore until her own dying day that the room smelled of smoke, and that the sound of scratching continued for several seconds after she discovered his body. His study was cleared, his books dispersed, his manuscripts archived. But they say that on quiet nights in Edinburgh, when the mist rises from the graveyards and the city sleeps, you can still hear it, the sound of a pen scratching on parchment, writing words that can never be unwritten, recording truths that were lies and lies that became truth. History remembers King James VI for his Bible and his Union of Crowns. It remembers the witch trials as a footnote, a curiosity of less enlightened times. It barely remembers John Fian at all, except as a name in old court records. But somewhere, in whatever space exists beyond this world, perhaps there is a different kind of record being kept. one where the torturer's mallet is recognized as less dangerous than the scholar's pen, where the flames that burn John Fian are understood to be less destructive than the words that lit them. For in the end, the real horror of this story isn't the torture, or the execution, or even the injustice. It's the truth that James Carmichael discovered too late, that evil doesn't always come with horns and sulphur. Sometimes it comes with a royal seal and a commission to tell the truth. Sometimes it comes with good intentions and scholarly precision. Sometimes it comes with nothing more than a pen, an inkwell, and the terrible human ability to make lies more powerful than truth. The pen, after all, is mightier than the sword, and sometimes that's the most terrifying truth of all.